It should go without saying that motorsport is and always has been packed with danger, but some eras and some jobs have been far riskier than others. Pit crews, drivers, track marshals, and safety personnel have historically put themselves in the line of fire to be able to compete in motorsport, but there was one job far more dangerous than the rest: riding mechanics. The name alone should give you an indication of just what this job entailed. These riding mechanics, or mechanicians as they were sometimes called, actually sat in the race car with the driver and performed various maintenance tasks while careening around the track at racing speeds. It was a dangerous job. 74 people have been killed in racing incidents in the Indianapolis Motor Speedway since the track's opening in 1909, and riding mechanics comprised 13 of those deaths during the very brief periods of time that they were used, from 1909 to 1920, and from 1930 to 1937. Today, we're delving into the abbreviated history of the riding mechanic, racing's most dangerous profession. Motorsport isn't just about fast cars and daredevil drivers. It's a place where scandals burn hotter than exhaust pipes. This is a history podcast dedicated to delving into the darkest corners of the racing world to uncover secrets, deception, and intrigue. My name is Elizabeth Blackstock, and welcome to Deadly Passion's Terrible Joys. As we've touched on a few times here at Deadly Passion's Terrible Joys, early vehicles were quite a handful. They were difficult to start, difficult to maintain, and difficult to drive. As with most inventions, the early days of the race car were less about optimization and more about just generally figuring out this new technology in the first place. So what exactly did a riding mechanic do? Well, he was effectively a passenger in a high-speed race car. The driver's job, obviously, was to keep the car on the road and to be faster than the competition, but the riding mechanic took care of just about everything else. Riding mechanics pumped oil or topped up the gas tank while at high speed. They kept an eye on any gauges that had been built into the car, watching things like oil pressure or temperature. They kept an eye on tire wear or scoped out broken bits of machinery that might need fixing in the pits. They served as a rearview mirror and a spotter, craning their necks to observe the competition and inform the driver of what was going on around him. If the car broke trackside, the riding mechanic was tasked with either making the repairs or even running back to the pits for help. They were even something of a personal assistant for the driver, providing him drinks or food or massaging his hands in the heat of battle. Despite serving some incredibly important roles, though, riding mechanics weren't regarded as being as critical to racing as the driver. Let me pull a section from Blood and Smoke, A True Tale of Mystery, Mayhem, and the Birth of the Indy 500 by Charles Leerhsen, which I think really helps encapsulate the role of the riding mechanics, and the way they were perceived by the racing community at the time. In exchange for low pay, usually $25 a week, and a small percentage of the prize money, and less glory, the riding mechanic was entrusted with greater responsibility than any driver. He was the last person to check the engine before the leather hood straps were secured. He had to crank the ignition at the start, and once the team was off and running, to make sure that gravity was keeping the fuel supply flowing and that the primitive splash oil system was functioning in its intended, if inefficient, fashion. He also had to inform the driver of who might be coming up on his left or his right, and pass along to him any signals or chalkboard instructions sent out from the pits. Riding mechanics and drivers communicated to each other with hand signs. One finger meant car coming, two meant the car getting closer, and making an O with the thumb and forefinger meant we need oil. As they sat hip to hip, signals were required because, as Joe Matson, a pilot for Chalmers Detroit, once explained, the wind, the bark of the exhaust, the roaring of other cars, and other things make talking impossible in a race. For the dedicated riding mechanic, maintaining one's dignity could be just as difficult as being heard. During a long race, he might find himself obliged to act as a doting mama bird, popping hot dog chunks and candy or pouring lemonade into a driver's yearning pie hole. He might hold a cigarette to the other man's quivering lips, massage his arms and neck, or lean across his lap and take the wheel while the driver unbuttoned his fly and relieved himself in a container. There was no telling what a driver might want a mechanic to do. When changing gears, Ralph De Palma would signal his co-pilot as he was stepping on the clutch, at which time the riding mechanic would do the actual shifting. The pressure was intense because he and De Palma both had to be in perfect sync, But De Palma calculated that by keeping both hands on the wheel through the process, he was able to save a fraction of a second each lap. Barney Oldfield liked his riding mechanic to keep an eye on his ever-present unlit cigar and replace it when it became too bitten down, lest Oldfield lose the cushion that kept his teeth from abrading and chipping as he negotiated the era's rough racing surfaces. In road races, Oldfield also wanted his riding mechanic to thump him solidly in certain spots on his back to indicate downshift for a blind curve and other specific developing situations. Louis Chevrolet liked his riding mechanic to pass him an open bottle of beer when they made pit stops. As that passage from Blend Smoke implies, riding mechanics weren't just an Indy 500 thing. These cars that were racing needed regular attention whether they were attempting 500 miles on an oval or battling for a win on a road course. Riding mechanics were also prevalent on the European Grand Prix circuit until about 1924. And while being a riding mechanic wasn't exactly glamorous here in the United States, we generally kept records of their names, if only for the Indy 500. In Europe, riding mechanics remained anonymous. Part of that comes down to the sentiment that the riding mechanics weren't actually important. In The Last Lap, The Mysterious Demise of Peter Kreis at the Indianapolis 500, author William Walker dedicates an entire book to understanding the crash that killed the racer Peter Kreis, but barely ever touches on the riding mechanic who also died. Walker describes riding mechanics as shouldering only modest responsibilities, even as he later writes of riding mechanics wresting the wheel away from drivers heading to their demise. It's a fairly common refrain throughout many motorsport narratives. When riding mechanics are killed, they earn little but a passing mention. When a driver is killed, he's remembered with beautiful prose and deep investigations into his life. I've only stumbled across a few really dedicated news stories about riding mechanics, one titled The Real Speed Demon on the Auto Racetrack by David Friedman. Here, Friedman laments the fact that everyone celebrates the winner, but no one, quote, drops a word of praise for the man who rode through the 500-mile Indianapolis grind at a speed greater than that of the fastest railroad train, gripping the sides of his skimpy little bucket seat as the pilot, braced against the big steering wheel, swung the swaying creature of man's inventions around the turn. Friedman also goes on to note that many people see the mechanician as an ornament or a mascot, and they don't really realize that the riding mechanic plays a very important role in the race and is exposed to far greater danger than the driver himself. Most of their news stories of the time, though, really only place value on the riding mechanics who moved up to become drivers. If you weren't serving as a riding mechanic as a way to get some experience to become a professional racer, then what were you doing? And there were also plenty of stories dedicated to quashing the riding mechanic trend. As the Fresno Bee published in February of 1923, it is a long step from the sidelines to the driver's seat in a car capable of turning the track at 125 miles an hour, a step that can't be made without riding mechanics gaining actual valuable race experience. Speed is a matter of training, the report says, and a man must have the natural aptitude for the game, and then he must be trained just as an artist is trained. That anti-mechanician sentiment was argued alongside a paragraph challenging the assertion. The only way to train a man for racing is to have him ride at the death-defying pace until he feels at home in a car traveling at 125 miles per hour, and then he can start to drive and develop from the slower speeds to the point where he can hold his own. That same author calls riding mechanics the crown princes of the speedway. Meanwhile, over in England, the Daily Mail was asking how a driver alone could be expected to take on all the tasks associated with running a race car. Analyzing the instrument board, taking care of on-track maintenance, scoring laps, paying attention to signals from the pits, and so much more. Even if the driver managed to do all these things for himself without help, the paper writes, there still remains the question of looking out for other cars overtaking, which would necessitate his looking round, a fatal proceeding. For the first few decades of mechanician-equipped motorsport, the only thing we really lacked in those news reports was any indication of how the riding mechanics themselves felt, or how the drivers felt utilizing their services. They were largely just an accepted fact of motorsport, something that you could count on, but as time passed and the racing went on, those mindsets began to change, and we would begin to hear more from the drivers and mechanics about what would go on to become a hotly contested element of the American racing world. I don't know about y'all, but I am still coming down from the Indy 500, and I'm not quite ready to let the month of May slip away just yet. That's why I'm heading to Homefield Apparel's website to stock up on the best open wheel merch the Speedway Indiana Clothing Company has to offer. Homefield is dedicated to bringing the best vintage style racing merch on the market, and the Indy 500 collection this year really shows what an amazing job that design team can do. There are so many great throwback items in this collection, and you don't want to miss out. Head to the link in my bio to check out your options, and don't forget to use code DPTJ15 for 15% off your first purchase. The race most closely associated with riding mechanics is, without question, the Indianapolis 500. But the very first iteration of the 500 was won by a solo driver. When Ray Haroon secured his victory in 1911, the only aid inside his Marmon Wasp came from the presence of a rear-view mirror, which we think is the first one ever used in an automobile and certainly the first ever used in a race. For that first year, the use of riding mechanics was optional, albeit highly recommended. The Marmon Wasp, though, was a true single-seater, and there wasn't space for Haroon's right-hand man, Harry Gates. But in the May 26, 1928 edition of the Indianapolis News, Haroon actually had a lot more to say. Harry didn't ride with me in this race on account of my car being a single-seater streamlined type, which was an innovation at that race, Haroon said. In the designing of this car, we had concluded that a live mechanician was better than a dead one, and Harry wasn't the only beneficiary in the arrangement. In early years, all race car accidents in these cars, the mechanic was the victim, principally because he didn't have much to hang on to and was either thrown out at the first bounce or beat the driver to what we dubbed the basement, meaning under the cowl. In the latter case, there wasn't room for both, and the driver stood the impact. Haroon's thinking in that case was right on the money. On lap 12 of the inaugural Indianapolis 500-mile sweepstakes, racer Arthur Greiner lost control of his American Simplex after it blew a tire. Both Greiner and his riding mechanic, Sam Dixon, were thrown from the wreck. Greiner only suffered a broken arm, while Dixon was thrown into a fence 20 feet away from the car. It's unclear whether or not he died instantly, but the ultimate result was fatal. It made Haroon's decision to implement a rearview mirror instead of a riding mechanic look pretty smart. But the following year, the AAA Contest Board, which sanctioned many motorsport races including the Indy 500, decided that riding mechanics needed to be mandatory for all races exceeding 100 miles. It's a little bit challenging to find the exact reasoning given for that change thanks to inconsistent record keeping, but as I mentioned earlier in this episode, riding mechanics served a lot of vital roles. Just because Ray Haroon had found a way to avoid using one didn't mean everyone was able to manage without one, and it seems as if the AAA was weighing the safety of the drivers above the safety of the riding mechanics. And so the fatalities continued. During the 1919 Indy 500, driver Louis Lecoq and his mechanician Robert Bandini were both killed when the Romer Special they were driving flipped and burst into flames. 4 years later, in 1923, riding mechanics were made optional by the AAA. Only one team utilized the mechanician, the Mercedes team of rookie Christian Lautenschlager. Their race lasted for a mere 14 laps before Lautenschlager crashed, thankfully without injury to himself or his riding mechanic. For the subsequent 7 runnings of the Indy 500, riding mechanics were optional, but no one used them. Meanwhile, over in Europe, riding mechanics were officially banned in 1924 after the death of Tom Barrett and the San Sebastian Grand Prix. Barrett had always had a mechanical bent, and in the early years of his career, he worked on fuses, airplane engines, and then Sunbeam road cars. It was his role at Sunbeam that saw Barrett move into the role of riding mechanic for driver Callum Lee Guinness, when Guinness's normal riding mechanic was injured in a crash at Brooklands. Barrett was substituted in, and the Sunbeam crew traveled to Spain with high hopes. Unfortunately, the weather for that September race was poor, and the wet track was made even more slippery after locals tried to sprinkle sand on it. They intended the sand would be used for more grip, but the clay-like earth of the region only made things all the more treacherous. On lap 11 of the San Sebastian Grand Prix, Guinness hit a rut in the road and lost control of his sunbeam. The car left the track, spun, flipped, and then came to rest back on the racing surface. Guinness was thrown free from the crash, though he had sustained serious enough injuries that he never raced again and ultimately committed suicide in 1937. Barrett, however, died at the scene of the accident. As a result, the use of riding mechanics was instantly banned in Europe. Sports cars were still required to feature 2 seats in an attempt to mimic the passenger cars on which they were based, but no one would be allowed to fill those seats. News of the mechanician ban surely crossed the Atlantic, but the AAA Contest Board saw no reason to follow suit. In fact, in 1930, it reinstated the mandatory use of riding mechanics as part of a sweeping set of rule changes that came to be known as the Junkyard Formula. At the time, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway was owned by former fighter pilot Eddie Rickenbacker, and Rickenbacker wasn't keen on the fact that the cars duking it out on the speedway were looking more and more like purpose-built race cars, as opposed to the vehicles the average Joe would see on the road. Rickenbacker felt the whole purpose of the Indy 500 was to be a proving ground for lightly modified road machines. He wanted fans in the audience to see the cars they recognized out on the track, noting that now, quote, even a Model T can win. Gone were superchargers, gone was the limitation on a 33-car starting field, engine displacement increased from 1.5 to 6 liters, and most critically for our purposes, Rickenbacker reinstated the mandatory use of riding mechanics. These changes were not popular, as the Junkyard Formula name might suggest. Though many people assume that these rules were implemented to stave off the impact of the Great Depression, many historians actually contend that that timing was just coincidental, as Rickenbacker had been dreaming up this specific rule set all the way back in 1928. When it became clear that drivers would have to utilize a riding mechanic in 1930, we saw a significant shift in the way those riding mechanics were discussed publicly. Instead of just being another feature of the race car, they actually started to play into the public discourse as human beings. Racer Bob McDonough, for example, decided that if he was going to be forced to race with a riding mechanic, then it might as well be with a punch-drunk boxer. I won't know what to do with a riding mechanic, for in all my races, I have been doing all the work myself, McDonough told the Courier-Journal in April of 1930. It is just like sticking another pair of arms on me. I wouldn't be able to use them. So I have decided to select a good punch-drunk boxer who doesn't weigh too much and who has been properly battered into submission in the ring. McDonough's thinking here is that the vibrations in the race car, paired with the intense speed and forces exerted on the car's passenger, would present a significant challenge to normal folks whose brains weren't accustomed to being jostled around in their skulls. A boxer who had taken a few blows to the noggin would be perfect, especially because McDonough didn't want a helper. I will arrange his seat beside me so that he will not be in the way and will have nothing whatsoever to do with the activities at the wheel, McDonough said. I will strap him into place with an airplane safety belt, and he may go to sleep if he can. Not everyone was quite so jovial about it, though. Louis Meyer, who had won the 1928 Indy 500, noted his annoyance in a November 1929 edition of the Morning Call. Like so many younger drivers, I have never had any experience with a riding mechanic. I believe he'll be in the way. He's supposed to tell you when something has gone wrong. How can he hear you when you're half deaf from the motor of the road? He asked, and then continued, another thing, as racing cars are now built, the driver can get a pretty good view of all 4 wheels. I don't know whether he can with another fellow in there with him. The riding mechanic won't be any help if he jostles against you when the car hits a turn and you're trying to keep the back from beating the front on the straightaway. But rules are rules. Meyer claimed he wouldn't race at the 1930 Indy 500, but ultimately he did. He finished 4th. Even former riding mechanics were actually pretty frustrated. Riley Brett, who had made his final appearance as a mechanician in 1922, had become a fantastic chief mechanic on several cars that went on to take the AAA championship. When asked about his role in the 1930 race, he said, I'm getting the car ready, but they'll have to get somebody else to ride the race with Louis Meyer. I'm through. Brett clarified that he wasn't stepping away from the riding mechanic role because his final outing in 1922 had ended in a crash, one that thankfully didn't hurt either the driver or his mechanic. And he also clarified that he wasn't stepping back because he was old. Instead, he said, "I just can't get into the proper mental attitude to ride again. For years, I couldn't get enough of speed, but for the last 7 years, I've been forced by racing rules to get my thrills from the pit of the car on which I was working. Now I've lost all desire to whirl around the track at dizzy speeds. It looks dangerous now. It didn't used to. I guess it really isn't any more dangerous, except that the cars are moving a lot faster these days than they were when I was riding and driving." Riley Brett, though, had an established career, and he knew he could contribute to a 500 winning car. According to the Daily Star's April 18, 1930 newspaper, though, very few men were going to have that ability, because over 150 new drivers had filed applications to enter the race. The author notes that while some may qualify, quote, "many more of them will become riding mechanics, sitting beside the drivers in the two-man cars demanded for the coming contest." As I've noted before, the role of a riding mechanic was often seen as a way for a young driver to gain some kind of experience before actually racing themselves. The young drivers who failed to make the race would likely leap at the opportunity to experience Indy 500 racing speeds from inside the cockpit and to better understand what it would take to manage a race. However, you still had plenty of riding mechanics that wanted a piece of the action. 38-year-old Thane Hauser began riding in 1916, and he was ready to take up the mantle again. As he told the newspapers, he'd never earned a nickel from his work, which is why he was especially keen on riding with a winner, not a forlorn hope. Still, he'd earned quite a bit of star power when, at a non-500 race, he took over steering his team's car after the driver collapsed at the wheel. Hauser brought it home in fourth. Other riding mechanics found a little celebrity thanks to the revitalization of the rules. Cotton Henning, for example, had earned a reputation as a great guy in the previous riding mechanic era, when he and driver Peter DiPaolo were thrown from their car. After Henning regained consciousness, he immediately leaped into action to pull DiPaolo from the race car, which he believed was on fire. All while the cars flew by, still on the racing surface. However, the big storyline about Hennings heading into 1930 was his weight. Riding mechanics were like jockeys in the sense that lighter was better, and Henning had gained weight since his last outing. Several news stories focused on what he was doing to slim down, which included doing road work in a rubber suit and jogging around the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Other big positive moments came with the signing of Tak Harashima as a riding mechanic, making him the first American-born man of Japanese descent to play a significant role in the Indy 500. In 1935, racer Pete DiPaolo also made headlines by signing movie star Richard Arlen to be his riding mechanic in the 500-mile event. As we approached the mid-1930s, some riding mechanics began to spend more time in the spotlight, beyond just brief mentions of their existence or of their injuries and death. Tak Harashima was briefly profiled in a January 1936 edition of Daily News, and a few months later, riding mechanic Vern Lake offered a greater profile in his local Tulsa world. But not all was well, and as the decade progressed, it became clear to both the AAA contest board and to the heads of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway that the riding mechanic revival would have to come to an end. On May 30th, 1930, riding mechanic Paul Marshall was killed in a car driven by his brother Cy. The pair had lasted under 30 laps around the Indianapolis Motor Speedway before Cy Marshall crashed in turn 3. Cy was pinned in the wreckage, but he survived. His brother had been thrown from the race car. His cause of death was determined to be a fractured skull. In the very first race featuring riding mechanics after a 7-year hiatus, one had died. During practice for the 1931 Indianapolis 500, driver Joe Caccia lost control of his car, and both he and his riding mechanic, Clarence Grove, were thrown from the machine before it burst into flames. Unfortunately, the car landed on the men shortly after. Both were killed. During qualifying for the 1932 Indianapolis 500, Benny Benefiel and riding mechanic Harry Cox were warming up the car, the exact same car that had killed Joe Caccia and Clarence Grove the year before. Benefield lost control and launched the car over the outside of Turn 1, where it proceeded to fall 18 feet to the ground. Benefield was seriously injured, but Cox was killed. During qualifying for the 1933 Indianapolis 500, driver Bill Denver and his riding mechanic Bob Hurst were killed on a warm-up run. During the race itself, drivers Mark Billman and Lester Spangler were killed. Spangler's riding mechanic, G.L. Monk Jordan, also died. Spangler was attempting to avoid a spinning car on lap 132, but ended up plowing into the machine head-on at over 100 miles per hour. The car rolled at speed, ejecting and killing both of its occupants. During practice for the 1934 Indianapolis 500, the aforementioned Pete Kreis lost control of his car, which mounted the outside wall, tumbled for 15 feet, and hit a tree. Kreis was killed instantly. His riding mechanic Bob Hahn died shortly after. During qualifying for the 1935 Indianapolis 500, driver Stubby Stubblefield lost control of his car, which rode over the Turn 2 wall, flipped, and threw both driver and riding mechanic Leo Whitaker into the fence. Both men died en route to the hospital on the same day that driver Johnny Hannon was killed making his first practice run. On race day itself, driver Clay Weatherly was killed attempting to compete behind the wheel of the late Johnny Hannon's car. His riding mechanic, Francis Bradburn, was critically injured but survived. After a quiet, death-free 1936 came a horrifying 1937. 2 pit attendants were killed in practice when a Duesenberg burst into flames and crashed into the Studebaker that the pit attendants were servicing. During qualifying later that same day, driver Frank McGurk managed to complete 4 of his 10 qualifying laps when his car crashed through an inner rail. McGurk was injured as he was thrown from the car, but his riding mechanic, Albert Opalco, was killed. Of course, those weren't just the notable deaths and injuries. Countless other drivers and riding mechanics were seriously injured during the month of May between 1930 and 1937, including driver Louis Schneider and riding mechanic Spider Matlock in 1931, driver Al Aspin and riding mechanic Mitz Davis, and riding mechanic Elmer Lombard in 1933, as well as driver Orville Baker and riding mechanic Pete Keeling in 1934. It was a dangerous time to be in a racing machine no matter what, but the sheer fact of being a passenger in a high-speed vehicle seemed to be imbued with an even greater risk. Making things all the more challenging for American motorsport overall were the origins of the 1930 riding mechanic mandate. Because the idea had come from Eddie Rickenbacker and was largely designed for the Indy 500, many tracks weren't clear about whether or not they needed to implement riding mechanics. Events at Altoona in Pennsylvania occasionally used the riding mechanic format, but following the 1930 edict came a slew of newspaper articles assuring folks that things hadn't changed at, say, Langhorne or Ascot Speedway, while other tracks utilized the riding mechanic format just because they could. Still, other tracks that utilized riding mechanics faced similar fatalities as a result of the crashes. Even lower speeds at shorter tracks failed to save the lives of many men that could still be thrown from the car unnecessarily. Meanwhile, Rickenbacker was aware that after the 1933 running of the Indy 500, something needed to change. 5 people were killed during 1933's month of May, and it was clear that current trends were unsustainable. But rather than remove riding mechanics from the equation, Rickenbacker instead proposed a forced reduction of speed. In 1936, the AAA Contest Board eliminated the use of riding mechanics on dirt tracks, and 2 years later, Eddie Rickenbacker finally decided that for 1938, riding mechanics would once again become optional, though not because of the danger. Instead, Rickenbacker wanted to once again stimulate international interest, and because foreign drivers hadn't used riding mechanics for over a decade, it made sense to tweak the rules to better encourage their participation. No riding mechanic was ever again used in the Indianapolis 500. While drivers like Ray Haroon showed that early motorsport theoretically could have existed without the use of riding mechanics, it would have been nearly impossible to imagine the growth of the racing world, especially in the United States, without them. Competitively racing a car required the presence of a riding mechanic for many years, and those mechanicians were required by rule for many years after. It's a true shame that we've written the men undertaking that thankless job out of history. Let me return for a moment to The Last Lap by William Walker, the book that tells the story of Peter Kreis's mysterious Indy 500 practice crash in 1934. Riding mechanic Bob Hahn is described as being a 21-year-old raised on a turkey farm estate, though he was having a difficult time thanks to a series of poor racing results and the separation from his wife. Hahn is said to have met Kreis's mechanic in California, where he asked for some experience to see if he could understand why his own driving performance had been so poor. Hahn's reward was a position as Kreis's riding mechanic, and that's it. That's all we know. Walker speculates that perhaps Kreis looked over at his young riding mechanic as they crashed to their deaths, but the next concrete fact we receive about Bob Hahn is about his brutal death. When other riding mechanics are mentioned in the book, it's with that same sort of callous attitude, that these men existed and died, and that is the sum total of their contribution to motorsport. I think the sheer lack of information about riding mechanics is what struck me most while I was working on this episode. There are multiple forums still dedicated to identifying the men who served as riding mechanics in European Grand Prix because those riding mechanics weren't deemed important enough to note on an official entry list. We remember some riding mechanics like Jimmy Murphy, Pete DiPaolo, and Kelly Patillo, but only because they went on to become racing drivers. We remember men like Joseph F. Kennelly because his death in 2011 meant that the last living riding mechanic was gone. With him went a wealth of lived experience that few people thought to mine. It is, honestly, very shocking to me. I approached this episode really hoping to learn more about the role of the riding mechanic, and I was unable to access enough information online to feel like I really could tell a comprehensive story, which, in many ways, is the story I'm telling. The papers didn't give these men much credence, which means our written records are few and far between. We remember the men who died, but not outside of the circumstances of their death, and not as the primary focus. When public opinion began to change and discourse shifted to focusing on the dangers to the lives of the men involved, the conversation was still never really personal. It was detached from the lived experience of riding mechanics, unless they were, for example, a legendary riding mechanic like Riley Brett. For those countless other mechanicians who served infrequently as one-offs or who died in the throes of a race, we know so much less. Drivers have always dominated the spotlight, and it makes sense why. After all, they're the ones loaded with the spectacular talent that is so obvious to anyone who tunes in to watch a race. The quick-witted strategists, the visionary designers, and the dedicated pit crew workers rarely have a similar opportunity to bask in that glow. In fact, we really only notice them when they do a bad job. Riding mechanics were even more invisible. Even though they sat right next to the driver in the car and directly contributed to that driver's ability to finish a race, their contributions have been almost intentionally lost to time. Over in Europe, no one thought to write down a mechanician's name. In America, we may have done the bare minimum, but record keeping was often inaccurate, and there was never much to these men beyond those names. So little acknowledgement for such a significant impact. Riding mechanics are the true unsung heroes of early 20th century racing. Early motorsport events could not have existed without them, and the ever-improving tides of technology shouldn't discount the significance of their contributions. Their stories are ones that deserve to be heard. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys. The next time we chat, it'll be just before the iconic 24 Hours of Le Mans, and I'll be talking about the aftermath of the 1955 Le Mans disaster. Many of us know the story of that accident and the general impact it left on motorsport, but I want to delve into the details about the days, weeks, and months immediately following the devastating tragedy. If you enjoyed this episode, Please subscribe to the show, give it a rating, and leave a review. And if you're hungry for more, make sure to subscribe to the DPTJ Patreon. Tiered patrons get exclusive access to weekly blog posts where I delve deeper into contemporary motorsport news, as well as plenty of the good stuff from the past. Plus, if you want to send an email, I have an address for that. deadlypassionsterriblejoys@gmail.com. Thank you so much to my wonderful Patreon subscriber, Ryan Lorman. Ryan became the very first, the inaugural member of the World Champions Patreon tier, which means so much to me and I'm sure to everyone who gets a chance to listen. Ryan, thank you so much for the wonderful ongoing support and for being the first official DPTJ WDC. I also want to read out a really great comment I received from Altadro, who writes, "If there is anyone you want to tell racing stories, it is Elizabeth Blackstock, especially if the stories involve scandal, intrigue, and mystery. I'm really looking forward to enjoying this podcast." Well, Altadro, I hope you have been enjoying all of it. Finally, don't forget to check out Home Field Apparel. The Indy 500 might be in the rearview mirror, but it is never too early to start prepping your wardrobe for next year. Make sure to check out the link in my bio and sign up for updates or pick out your favorite outfits. And don't forget to use code DPTJ15 for 15% off your first purchase. Finally, we're ending with La Source, the segment named after the iconic turn at Spa-Francorchamps, but that serves as my bibliography for each episode. It's important to me to cite regularly and accurately, so I'm giving a shout out to the most influential sources at the end of each show. You can also find the full list of sources in the episode description. This week I've pulled some incredible quotes from two books: The Last Lap, The Mysterious Demise of Peter Kreis at the Indy 500 by William Walker, and Blood and Smoke, A True Tale of Mystery, Mayhem, and the Birth of the Indianapolis 500 by Charles Leerhsen, both of which are incredibly detailed and fascinating reads. I also referenced a ton of old newspaper sources, which are all linked in the description below if you want to read them for yourself. Thank you all again for listening to Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys, and I will see you in the next episode.